today, I believe, which is non-wires alternatives. So, Deb, if you want to show the agenda, that would be great. So we are going to take you through this series this morning, similar to what we've done every other time. We're going to give you a little summary of the minutes from the last meeting. We're going to have a presentation by Lauren Schwitzberg of RMI. We're going to ask you for just clarifying questions about the presentations, things you didn't understand. And then we take you through a facilitated process where we're going to ask you specific types of questions to try to lead to common understanding and maybe consensus on some issues. So if I interrupt you or call on you, please know that it's part of the process that we use. And then we'll just do a really brief survey at the end and talk about our next steps and our next webinar. So let's go ahead to the minutes. So when we talked last time, we talked about non-wires. I mean, we talked about hosting. What did we talk about? Hold on, where are my notes? We talked, sorry, we talked about hosting capacity, and that was on the 21st. Some of the things that came out of that conversation is the fact that you do hosting capacity for different reasons. You can do it to specifically look for where to put distributed energy resources on your system, or you can do it to have a system-wide look at your distribution system. Knowing what your use case at the beginning is important, because the first step in developing a hosting capacity analysis, or HCA, is to collect data, and many times the data has to be refined. You do HCAs because you're trying to identify constraints in the system where you can't put on DERs. You're trying to increase visibility for both the utility and for the public. You're trying to improve your performance of your system, and possibly helping developers know where they should look to implement distributed energy resources and where things are constrained. So long term, we want to be able to know more about where things can be interconnected, and also be able to avoid upgrades where they're not necessary. One of the things that's important to understand about hosting capacity analysis is that after that's done, then you do interconnection studies. So it's not, HCA is not an interconnection study. We also heard from our speakers that HCA is done in phases, and it's important for people to understand that it takes time. First, you map the system. That's the first maybe information that's made available to the public. Then you may target certain areas to do analysis, and then you may expand to be over the whole system. So Deb, I don't know that that's readable at all. So maybe you can go back to the agenda, since I'll just recap it for people. You know, it takes time to offer these interactive maps, which I think ultimately is what developers and other folks are interested in HCA, is actually seeing the system and where opportunities are. We heard that quantifying the benefits of doing the analysis can be difficult, and that assigning costs, if upgrades are needed to be able to bring on more distributed energy resources, assigning the costs of who should pay for the upgrades, that's a matter of policy, and that policy hasn't necessarily been decided. But HCA in general is critical to be able to look at the electrical system and be able to support the distributed energy resources coming onto the system. So we had a great presentation last time and a really good set of discussions. So that was our summary of HCA.
And Amanda, if I can just interrupt you a minute, just wanted to let you know that Commissioner Fishman is with us, as Vice Chair Hall has made it. So just,
good. Very good.
Just an acknowledgement of the two of them being with us this morning.
Thank you, Jeff. And Commissioner Hall, I know you got in late last night, so thanks for joining us. So I So now I want to turn to the presentation today, and we're really lucky to have Lauren Swissberg available to us today. So, and Lauren's on, right, Jeff? I can't see.
Yes, I saw her name there in the participants. So
Okay, good morning,
Yep.
Lauren.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. So Lauren has a great background. She has a undergrad from Duke and a master's from Stanford in civil and environmental engineering. She was a civilian engineer for the Navy and a fellow for the Clean Energy Leadership Institute in Washington, D.C. So she works for RMI now in the carbon-free electricity practice, where she's a manager, and she leads research and collaboration projects to support rapid transition to low carbon electricity system. She concentrates on renewable energy and distributed energy resources and its role in grid planning and investment. So she's absolutely perfect for today. So Lauren, thanks for joining us. And we're going to give you about 20 minutes to give a presentation, and then we'll go into clarifying questions, and then we'll go into a facilitated discussion. So to you, Lauren.
Great. Thanks so much for that intro, Amanda. And big thank you to Matthew, Jeff, Amanda, the GridWorks team for inviting me to speak today. It's really great to be here with you all to talk about non-wires alternatives. As Amanda shared, I'm a manager in our electricity practice at RMI. And much as my work has really been around integration of distributed energy resources, worked with a variety of utilities and regulators on this topic, both domestically and abroad as well in Australia. So just wanted to reiterate too that folks across the country and around the globe are grappling with some of the same challenges that you all are here to talk about through this workshop series. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Those look all right? Okay, great.
Thank you.
Perfect. So first, to kick us off, for those of you who might not be familiar with RMI, RMI is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, and zero carbon future for all. We like to say that our work is primarily focused on working on 4 sectors in 5 places. So the 4 sectors being industry, mobility, buildings, and electricity. And the 5 places being China, India, the US, the global South, and cities globally. So we also work on what we call a number of market catalysts, things that we believe will really accelerate the energy transition. So cross-cutting topics across policy, finance, business models, data transparency, and education and capacity building as a core tenet of our work as well. Before we get into the content, I just wanted to offer a definition of non-wire solutions for those of you who may be less familiar with the concept. The definition that I pulled here is from Wood Mackenzie. Non-wire solutions are projects in which utilities use distributed energy resources and other technologies to reinforce the grid instead of relying on conventional transmission and distribution assets. So I thought this definition really captures the main idea here, avoiding grid investment or traditional grid investment by using distributed energy resources. When I say DERs or distributed energy resources, what I really mean here is actually a number of technologies. Behind the meter, I'm talking about energy efficiency, demand flexibility, including smart water heaters, thermostats, behind the meter solar and storage, and potentially electric vehicles as well. Typically, we're talking about distribution system connected assets when we're talking about especially deferring a distribution opportunity. But sometimes we actually are talking about front of the meter assets, particularly storage in this concept, when we're talking about a larger distribution opportunity or a transmission deferral opportunity that we might be pursuing. So first, I just wanted to share 3 key messages, and this is the structure of the presentation that I'll just walk through. The first is that distribution costs are rising. So this really points to an opportunity here to identify lower cost alternatives and a real opportunity to get creative about how we manage these costs and provide bill savings for customers. The second is that non-wire solutions have demonstrated ability to provide benefits, including and beyond cost savings. So the market is not as nascent as it was 5 years ago, and we have seen a real number of projects be deployed with a lot of benefits, lessons learned, and many utilities have now had a few cycles to refine their processes for identifying, selecting, and sourcing projects. There's a lot of experience to draw from in terms of establishing a process. And then finally, there are many updates to both the regulatory, utility, and procurement practices that are really critical in supporting implementation of non-wire solutions. So there's been a lot of work to advance the market, but it does really require changes to be most effective, which I will talk through some more. Very quickly, I just also wanted to share that most of the content that I'm sharing today is built on a publication from 2018 that my team wrote, the Non-Wire Solutions Implementation Playbook. There's a lot more detail and examples in there. It's from 2018, so it was much earlier days in the development of non-wire solutions, but the general structure and recommendations are still largely relevant. There's just a lot more examples out there now of how utilities have approached this. So first, I just wanted to touch on, again, the motivation for non-wire solutions and put a finer point on the rationale here. So distribution system costs are rising. I'm going to go through these quickly, but I thought they were really important rationale for why non-wire solutions in particular can benefit ratepayers. So this first chart here from the EIA is really showing the point that growth in distribution spending has outpaced both additional customers and sales growth. So as we can see here in the chart, the first chart on the left here, distribution costs have increased by 64% for a corresponding growth of 21% in customers and only 11% in sales. So we're really seeing the costs rising faster than the number of sales and customers that the system is expected to serve. The majority of these distribution spending costs, when we look at them broken down by expense type across operations and maintenance, customer expenses and capital investment, we see that the majority of the increase, those top light blue bars here between 2000 and today, are coming from capital investment. So this really points to where we have this opportunity to reconsider and reduce costs, capital investment, which is really the core idea behind non-wire solutions, that we can reduce this top blue bar with DERs for some opportunities and some projects. So to bring this down to the household level really quickly, I just wanted to share what this looks like on residential bills in 2020. So nationally, the distribution system is actually the largest line item on a household electricity bill. So it makes up about 24% when we look across investor-owned utilities across the country. This data that I've shared here is from an RMI data portal called the Utility Transition Hub, which really is drawing from FERC Form 1 data. I also pulled on the right side here this data for just IOUs with a footprint in New Mexico. You can see here, New Mexico's distribution costs are a little bit under the national average with respect to the total amount of a residential customer bill that they are making up. And there are larger portions than the national average that are going towards transmission and traditional steam generators. So hopefully that gives you a picture of kind of both the national trend and where New Mexico is sitting with respect to that trend. So despite the fact that the costs are below the national average, I wanted to look at how they had changed over time. So here I'm showing just for New Mexico, the distribution costs between 2005 and today. And what we can see is that where in 2005, they were making up about $5 on a residential bill, about 8% of the total costs. Now they're up to about 1150, 13% of the total costs. So distribution system costs are still growing here, and they really matter to households trying to pay their energy bill. So non-wire solutions really present a real opportunity to understand where we might use DERs to mitigate some of those increases that we're seeing. So that's some of the rationale. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of the market and some of the benefits that non-wire solutions can provide. So non-wire solutions do really present somewhat of a win-win-win opportunity when they're implemented well here. Utilities can benefit, customers can benefit, and there are broader societal benefits as well. Starting with utilities, one of the key benefits that we've seen non-wire solutions provide is an opportunity to take actually a more modular approach to solving a transmission or distribution system problem. You don't have to deploy all at once, especially if the need is anticipated to emerge over an extended time period. For example, load growth on a specific feeder that's anticipated to grow over time. We've seen a lot of projects where in reality, the need hasn't emerged as anticipated because planning still has a lot of uncertainty, and taking a approach using DERs has actually shown that the need may not have ever materialized in the first place. And we've saved customers a lot of money by doing a little bit of implementation up front and allowing ourselves the flexibility to wait and see what might emerge. They're an opportunity to engage customers and communities, and which I'll talk about more later, can provide a rate of return if there are incentives in place. For customers, we've seen projects be able to reduce bills. So deploying energy efficiency, for example, in a geo-targeted area is a pretty simple example of how a project might reduce bills. In some projects, they've been structured to provide resilience as well. So batteries in Vermont, for example, have been used as backup for households, but they're also used by the utility for peak shaving. They can be used as they can be a local economic development opportunity. Given the geo-targeted nature of our projects, they're a real opportunity to create jobs, installers, marketers, and deep partnerships with community-based organizations as well. And finally, they can reduce emissions, especially when targeting peak load reduction, but also because assets can reduce generation the rest of the year and provide a higher quantity of clean generation on the grid. So the state of the market, as of August 2020, which is the most recent public data I've seen here, Wood Mackenzie had tracked 321 non-wires projects in their database, and those 321 projects were about 850 megawatts of total capacity. Of the projects that are implementation in progress, or a solicitation in progress, we have about 100 projects. So of those projects, the majority have still been implemented in New York and California, but you can see a lot of other states starting to emerge as a bigger part of the mix in the last couple of years. And I would expect that the 2022 numbers would even trend further towards states outside of New York and California. The most common resource that's been used across all these projects is front-of-the-meter storage. And one thing that you might notice here is the large percentage of projects not pursued here, 59%, that large yellow portion. I believe this to be high for a couple of reasons that I actually don't find too concerning. The first is that many states and utilities are now doing planning that surfaces the opportunities that are being counted here. So the intention is not for every project to be pursued, but instead to be identified and analyzed for its applicability and cost competitiveness with traditional options. The other thing is that we're really still learning here. So states are refining how they surface and identify the opportunities, and I would expect this percentage of projects not pursued to decline as we continue to refine the screening approaches over time and be able to identify the first time the projects that are best suited for non-wire solutions. Another key trend here that I'll highlight is that the rise of distribution system planning processes is a big factor at play here too. So at least 12 states have processes that require analyzing the opportunity for non-wires solutions. This is a chart that I believe that Lisa shared with y'all a few workshops back as well, but just wanted to really highlight that row that shows where non-wire solutions are part of the distribution system planning process. And those processes are really helping to generate the types of data and information that a utility needs to identify these projects. So for example, the hosting capacity analysis that Sky shared can point to the locations on the grid that may need a future distribution system upgrade. DER forecasting, which you all also had a workshop about, can help identify where DERs might necessitate an upgrade in the future that could be mitigated, or where they are likely to be able to be a big part of a solution as well. Interestingly, also some processes in Oregon, are surfacing community needs and building strong community partnerships that are really critical to deploying a successful geographically targeted program. And then more traditional information is coming through these processes as well, like the age of distribution system equipment, reliability conditions, et cetera. That's also really useful in identifying projects. So finally, projects have been deployed across the country. I'm not going to go into too many examples here because I want to focus more on the enabling infrastructure that might be needed to set up a process. But SEPA and PLMA and E for the Future released this great report. It's also from 2018, but it goes into detail on several project case studies, all the ones that are listed here, their benefits, and a lot of what the utilities and regulators learned through that process. So a really great resource. And again, just to highlight here that there's been a lot of projects deployed. So there's a lot of knowledge to tap when thinking about best practices for setting up a non-wires process. So finally, I wanted to get into what's needed to make non-wires solutions happen. So those regulatory, utility, and procurement changes, and particularly just highlight some of the ways that they've progressed in Minnesota and in Oregon. So first, the need is to establish a supportive regulatory environment. And you can read this slide as the set of things that I would expect might need to be included in a set of rules or regulatory requirements around non-wire solutions. So typically, we're starting from legislation, which flows to the commission, who will refine the vision. So HB 233 really sets the stage for this in New Mexico, authorizing the expenditures that can support modernizing the grid. I think it's a pretty good precursor for thinking about non-wire solutions because energy storage, demand response, and microgrids are already included in the descriptions of some of the types of investments that might qualify as grid modernization. There's lots in there around the criteria for engaging customers and enabling their choice is a key goal here. That's also really compatible with the idea of non-wire solutions as a form of grid modernization. And then there's a specific statement in there around specifically encouraging the opportunity for DERs to provide grid services as alternatives to traditional investment. So a distribution system planning process or grid modernization planning process is a great way to tie all of this together, prioritize the grid modernization options at hand here, and create a process for evaluating the opportunity for non-wires. So that's bucket number one here, is really setting the foundation for building something here. The next step is establishing incentives, which I'm going to detail on the next slide. There are a few other items related here below 3, 4, and 5 that are really critical enablers here. So the third bucket here is enabling data transparency and collecting the types of data that folks need to analyze the potential for non-wire solutions. So ideally, and most commonly, we've seen non-wires be a key output or component of a distribution system plan, but it's often helpful to carefully consider the types of data that solutions providers, for example, a demand response aggregator, might need to be able to successfully bid on a project. And defining the rules that support that level of data transparency that might be needed, not only to identify the opportunities, but to enable the solutions to be easily identified and built on with industry are really critical. So the fourth bucket here is establishing screening criteria. These are the criteria by which the utility might screen capital investment projects and choose which ones to analyze with alternatives. So often these include the age of the asset being upgraded, timing of the need, the total cost of the upgrade, and I'm going to share just a couple examples when I talk about Minnesota and Oregon. Finally, criteria around the types of stakeholder engagement that can best support this development of solutions here. So getting input from DER providers in particular is really critical in understanding what their technologies can do, what their current costs are, and then getting input from communities is really critical because they're the ones that will need to be support deploying DERs in a defined area. So investing in building those relationships can be really make or break for a project. So doubling down on the incentives piece, the range of incentives that have been used and tested for non-wire solutions is pretty wide. This table here is really a reference, is incentives that are focused broadly on deploying DERs or utilizing DERs to achieve goals like peak reduction. So this is similar to performance incentives around energy efficiency, which have been around in states for many decades, but there's really many states now that are offering more specific performance incentives for DER utilization or DER deployment. More specific incentives were tested in a lot of the early states here. So in New York, actually, with each project, the utilities were initially proposing their own incentive structure for the commission. So there was a lot of experimentation. They tried some share of savings agreement. So the utility would pass savings through to customers for avoiding an upgrade, but also keep a percentage of that savings. There were rate of return incentives tried in New York and California as well to make the projects more attractive, financially equivalent to a traditional capital project. It looks like cost allocation is a topic that's being considered in this docket, but it could be helpful to broadly consider what types of incentives proposed by the utility might look like to guide applications for projects. And this may also come up in broader proceedings around utility compensation, as it has in several states. So next, there's the challenge of building this into the utilities process. I've tried to diagram out what that looks like here on this slide with reference to some of the topics you all have covered in prior workshops. So usually considering non-wires, again, lives within a distribution system planning or integrated grid planning process. Data such as DER forecasts and hosting capacity help to identify where there are opportunities. Then typically the utility uses a set of screening criteria to narrow the list of major capital projects to ones that they think are best suited for non-wire solutions. Then those projects are analyzed. Often several states have used a cost benefit analysis framework to compare the cost of the traditional solution to a non-wire solution. And expanding the criteria in many states around purely a least cost frame has been a big focus. So if you look at, for example, the benefit cost analysis frameworks in New York and Rhode Island, there's societal costs embedded in there as well, and community benefits as well. that they're using to make decisions on in terms of whether or not they will pursue a project. And then finally, this analysis usually results in a list of needs that are suitable for non-wire solutions. And that can translate either into a program definition or a competitive solicitation, which I'll get into a little bit more. Technologies like AMI are critical to both getting some of those data inputs that you need to identify the opportunities and to actually enable the solutions for households as well. So finally, there's the choice of sourcing options. These are interrelated, but in some states, the outcome has most often been a competitive solicitation. So New York has taken this approach and really released a great number of non-wire solicitations. They can all be found on the utilities website, but National Grid and Con Edison in particular have now been doing this for over a decade and released, again, like tens to teens of solicitations. So their experience in releasing those types of solicitations has really refined over time, and there's a wealth of experience to learn from there. In others, establishing a more specific program or tariff has been the preferred approach. So we see this in bring your own device programs, for example. Non-wire solicitations have a few best practices. They require engagement to make sure that stakeholders understand the need, how their technologies might contribute, and how they will be evaluated. It's helpful to have pre-RFP feedback often to make sure technologies aren't being inadvertently excluded, especially when this is newer and everyone's still learning. And then technically, the technical approach that I really wanted to highlight is that a portfolio approach is often really critical to evaluating bids. DERs are highly interactive with one another. So folks evaluating bids typically want to model them together, acting in concert to understand the combinations that can best meet the need at the lowest cost. Finally, just a couple of examples. So from my perspective, both of these state commissions, Minnesota and Oregon, are newer to this process and have both taken some good first steps and have demonstrated that both the commission and the utilities are willing to continuously evolve and add complexity over time. So I'm sharing the text of the Minnesota order here on this slide at a high level. The PUC asked Excel to identify projects within 5 years, priced over $2 million as a starting place, and analyze the opportunities for non-wires to meet those needs. They also asked the utility to provide their own assessment of the types of projects that are most suitable from their perspective and feedback on how the screening criteria should evolve. So what this has meant in practice in Excel's 2019 distribution system plan, they looked at project types, mostly capital capacity driven projects, so projects driven by a capacity need. They used the 2 million cost thresholds. They looked at projects from 2022 to 2024. They also used risk as a screening criteria here. They identified 9 projects, analyzed all of them, and actually found none of them to be cost effective. So alone, if this were the stopping place, I would probably say that's insufficient or requires some more investigation. But what makes me confident that this process will continue to evolve and find projects that are cost effective in the future is really this bottom right set of activities. First, in parallel, the utility is pursuing a community-based non-wires pilot and really learning from that as they go. So not waiting on finding that perfect first opportunity, but pursuing a pilot and learning by doing as they refine the screening. Second, there's a commitment to refine the screening approach. So they're working with EPRI on developing a more advanced and automated screening tool to mesh with their distribution system planning tool. Finally, Oregon. Oregon is also really taking this idea of starting somewhere, learning by doing, and continuously improving to heart. The initial requirements in their first year this year that the utility has to identify grid needs, develop an accounting of costs and benefits and alternatives, and they need to evaluate 2 projects in a more detailed way and pilot particularly the community engagement approaches that would be needed to implement these types of projects in the future. So they lay out as well how they expect the process to evolve over time, including establishing a cost benefit analysis, re-examining regulatory incentives, building this capability into their distribution system planning software and tools, and making co-development of solutions with communities a really significant priority and part of future projects. And I'm going to stop there and invite questions, but I hope that's been a helpful overview of non-wires, how it's shaping up across the country and how some states are tackling this.
Lauren, that was super. Thanks so much, and really appreciate you doing your homework to bring in the other topics that we've talked about in this webinar series, because it built really nicely. So there's a number of questions in the chat, and I think for time efficiency, I'm going to go through some of those. These are mainly the questions just to ask for more clarity on things. So I'm going to read these off if folks are okay with that. So first is from Commissioner Hall, and she was interested if you could let us know the components of distribution capital costs.
Yeah, so usually when we're talking about capital costs and with respect to distribution spending, we're talking about specific physical components and upgrades. So we're talking about substation upgrades, feeder upgrades, new wires, new hardware components, new control components as well. Basically everything except for software.
Great, thank you. Tayoko was interested. You were going through the slides of who was doing what and the different examples, and he was interested in areas with high DER penetration. You know, is the non-wires alternative spending or activities, does that support areas where there's high penetrations of DERs? Meaning, are they correlating?
I think they roughly are. So California, for example, has pretty high penetration of DERs and has evolved this process over time and found a lot of valuable projects and opportunities to take this approach. But I think in places like New York, where DERs are less high in their penetration, this has really been an opportunity to kickstart the market. So I'm seeing the non-wires projects in New York, for example, as generating more DERs on the grid rather than managing them. But that flavor of approach definitely differs across states and jurisdictions.
Great. Matthew, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Just a real quick, you were talking about how how they were evaluated on a cost-benefit analysis, and noted that some of the states used energy efficiency methodologies, which usually comes down to the utility cost test. But have you seen anything outside of a utility cost test other than maybe adding, taking UCT plus societal benefits? Is there a different tack?
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely a little bit squishier on the non-wires projects in terms of how states are applying their benefit cost frameworks to evaluating these projects. New York in particular added a whole section to their energy efficiency benefit cost analysis framework, specifically around non-wires and how they're going to treat those projects. So I'm less familiar with the specific criteria that they're looking at there, but just to say that they've really built on that energy efficiency handbook and added this component to it. And it does include a range of societal values and benefits and utility values and benefits.
Great, thank you. And then Darren mentioned that Hyde Memorial State Park is an example of a non-wires alternative solution in New Mexico. And I wonder, Darren, if you just want to come on and tell us what that was. How did they repower?
Well, Hyde Memorial Park, which is up the hill from Santa Fe, lost their underground power line, which was put in privately by the state more than 40 years ago. It basically rotted away. And so the utility wasn't on the hook to replace that. And just looking at rerunning that cable underneath the highway that runs up to the ski area into the park was well into the 7 or 8 digits. And going solar with battery storage and a backup propane generator was more cost effective, and we did that under an energy service performance contract. So, so it's a completely off-grid power, renewable powered state park.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Darren. Appreciate that. So then Will asked about with state storage procurement mandates, they typically don't carve out behind the meter storage requirements, let alone where those should go. And he's asking, would you agree?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And I think that's why we're seeing in parallel the development of specific incentives around DER utilization in particular.
Okay. And then you went through incentives to provide for the utilities for doing non-wires alternatives. And the question from Brian is, have those been built into rules, or are utilities asking for incentives to go this direction?
Yeah, it's been a variety of approaches here. So in New York, actually, to start, the commission was not prescriptive around the incentive that they were offering, and actually just asked for the utilities when they were proposing their early projects to also propose the incentive structure with them and evaluate those kind of in a one-off basis. I would say that certainly evolved over time, and I believe they've had subsequent rulemakings to standardize the types of incentive approaches. But I think that was a really effective first step in really just trying to understand what the range of options could be here and seeing which ones were working well.
Great. Okay. People are adding to the chat. So apparently this is working for people as opposed to raising their hands. So Will from Sandia asked that you've got the FERC Order 222, which is working to try to stimulate aggregated DERs in wholesale markets. And he's wondering if you can look into the future and think about how state-driven policy may be affected by the work that's being done on the federal level. And are there things that you can think that the state could take action on to be in advance of the Order 2222 coming to fruition?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a lot to potentially cover here, but I think when we're talking about non-wire solutions, we're talking about essentially an aggregation of DERs that can monetize avoided distribution system or transmission value, which I see as distinct in some respects from the values that they could gain from wholesale market values, so energy or capacity. Some of those values have the potential to be stacked, and I would say that the most important thing to make sure that those two value streams can play well together is, one, understanding the distribution system and bulk system impacts of the DERs. So getting that degree of visibility where you can understand how the aggregations are likely to interact with one another if they're optimizing for different outcomes, and start to develop some frameworks around that as well. So try and outline the different types of participation models and where they will interact well and where they might come into conflict and how those conflicts might be resolved.
Thanks for that. Tayoko had asked that you didn't mention specifically smart inverters and that they are, a new capability that's available. So how does RMI see all these acronyms, this playing into non-wires alternatives, the smart inverters?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I didn't mention smart inverters in particular, but we've seen them play a role in specifically providing voltage support, frequency regulation at the distribution system level as part of aggregations. And those are really important grid needs too that DERs can help meet.
Okay. And one from Ron. So in in front of our implementation to date, do you expect we should include behind the meter DER in requirements and incentives?
Yeah, I think part of the reason we've seen a lot of front of the meter storage is some of the larger projects. So some of these larger transmission deferral projects, for example, have required front of the meter storage, but absolutely, I think, especially at the distribution system level and even at the bulk system level, behind the meter storage can play a huge role here. And Green Mountain Power in Vermont, I think, is one of the utilities using behind the meter storage very effectively to peak shave.
Great. Okay. In this slide that showed Minnesota and Excel, it looks like none of the non-wire solutions were found to be cost effective. So if they end up being not cost effective during the screening, what's the next step for the utility and for the commission?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's in a docketed proceeding. So I'm sure there have been lots of comments and back and forth around the assumptions and how the screening and evaluation process took place. Hopefully that the utility will be incorporating into their next round of consideration, or maybe even more immediately if that's the way the commission has decided to go. But I think the twofold is like, what are they going to do in the near term, and what improvements have folks recommended in the specific distribution system planning proceeding. And the second is just this longer term process of continuous improvement. I think when I saw that told me, wow, there's probably an opportunity to revisit these assumptions, get more creative, and build some new tools that can more accurately and broadly assess a range of values. So I'm seeing that commitment in the docket as well.
Okay, I just saw one more pop up. So can you give any examples of specific energy savings or peak shaving programs directed to defined geographic communities in order to defer distribution investments? Yeah,
so the most famous example here is the Brooklyn Queens demand side management program. They're trying to avoid a over $1 billion substation upgrade in Brooklyn and Queens in New York, and have achieved about 51 megawatts of peak reduction in that really specific geographic area with efficiency, demand response, and behind the meter storage, which is pretty impressive. There have been other utilities. Most of my best top of mind examples are in New York, but I'm sure I could find some more around the country as well. Central Hudson is another utility in New York in the Hudson Valley that did a really great demand response driven program where they were doing a lot of pool pump demand response and kind of some of those more creative device options that they coupled together to avoid some major distribution system upgrades as well. And that's called the Central Hudson Peak Perks program.
Excellent. Thank you, Chairman Fishman. Any other last questions on clarifying before we go to our facilitated discussion? Okay, great. So what we wanted to accomplish today is to hear about non-wires alternatives and what stakeholder concerns and considerations are, and then try to get some clarity on what needs to be addressed in a grid rule. So if you'll move on, Deb. So this is where we're going to go through. We've been doing this with you a couple of different webinars where we want to talk about grounding, reflective, interpretation, and decisional. We're going to take this off in just a second, but first is grounding. So what did you hear and what stood out to you? And I would love it if people would turn on their cameras if you would. We would like to hear from as many folks as possible. You know, we will call on you and the utilities to hear what your thoughts are. So Deb, you can take those down and let's have some good discussions. What stood out to you? What did you hear in this discussion that was striking? Matthew.
Well, this is just really getting to what I'm tasked to do over at EPE. So I was absolutely ecstatic to hear everything that came out of this. It's just about establishing the means of being able to accurately capture the benefits, and to ensure that that we're doing so in a meaningful, purposeful way. Which I think, if we kind of follow the steps that have been outlined here, I think we can kind of we can get to that, because at this point in time, that division, the meter is no longer as sacrosanct as it used to be, as far as dividing the utility from the customer. And there's a lot that we can do behind the meter that can save us. And a lot of the programs that you've ticked off were ones that I've looked at and, trying to copy their homework.
Excellent. And I didn't mention this at the top because you all are getting so used to our process, but if you don't have your affiliation next to your name, it's really helpful if you put it next to your name. So other things that struck you, what stood out in the presentation?
I'll go if.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, yes. So one thing that struck me too is it seems like a lot of this stuff is very utility specific. And I think it somewhat recognizes the fact that all the utilities in the various states have different systems and different issues and different customer bases and things like that. So what I think needs to keep in mind here is when we're developing a rule for the whole state, that the differences in the systems and the populations and the customer bases between the three utilities is considered. So that's my comment.
Great, thank you, Brian. Other things that struck you, that stood out?
Well, I'll throw in a couple of observations. Is that from a regulatory standpoint, as a regulator, we don't look very closely at distribution costs. We don't approve distribution projects. We get 440 submissions. And it seems like the entire regulatory process in this area kind of presumes that whatever the cost is of distribution, you don't have many options. So you just kind of do what you have to do, and it gets put into the rate base. And that all presumes that you didn't have any options. And what really stands out now is that as technology advances, there are lots of options. And with the level of investment that's going into distribution, thank you, Lauren, for pointing that out, it seems very outdated that we don't have kind of a specific way of evaluating options for how we move forward with distribution investments, including non-wires alternatives, and that we have to just take a look at that part of the regulatory construct, and that we have to dig in deeper than we have in the past.
Thank you, Chairman. Mark?
Thank you. I missed part of the presentation, so if I'm stepping on something already been discussed, just put the brakes on me. Department of Transportation is currently has available approximately $38 million with regard to funding for electric vehicle charging stations. And I don't know how far they've gone through the thinking process of where these things are going to go, how they're going to be monitored, and where they're going to get the power to run them. We've done some solar projects here on state buildings where they're actually feeding the charging stations that are out in front of our different buildings throughout Santa Fe. But when we go into the hinterlands of New Mexico, that becomes a little more challenging. And I don't know if there's someone we can reach out to kind of plan this out and figure out how to best roll it out. I guess that's the ask.
Great, Mark, thank you. We will certainly note that. Tayoko?
Thanks. Lauren. This was a great presentation, and I appreciate you digging into some of the specifics around New Mexico. And one aha for me was just that, okay, we're spending a lot less than nationally, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I'm not sure which way I would interpret that, but I'm raising that question about where we are in and how do we interpret that that particular result that you dug into. And so I think just having this level of detail is really, really valuable. Thank you.
Lauren, do you have any response to that?
I don't. I was curious as well, and I think it would require some further investigation as to why the costs have been lower than the national average.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, not sure if Jim or Kyle put their hand up first, but let's go to Jim, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Lauren. That was such a great presentation, covered a lot, and also very understandable. I just wanted to say what stood out to me, or one of the things, is that the distribution costs are rising faster than the increase in customers and sales. And I'm not quite sure what to make about that, but I'm going to be thinking about that. And I also want to echo Commissioner Fishman's comments that I think we need to look more at distribution costs and how we can, work on that in that area. And then finally, Mr. Hayden, thank you for the statement about 38 million for EV chargers as an EV owner. I really appreciate that. And I would be happy to give you my thoughts on that. I have a lot, but on a somewhat more serious note, maybe a focus group of people, of EV owners, because I think those people would be a wealth of information. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I appreciate that people are already moving into kind of a reflective questions, which are more about what confused you, intrigued you, surprised you, concerned you. So let's go next to Kyle.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Just one thought I had on the cost piece of it. That's something that's very important to Xcel Energy, and the impact that the distribution and other system investment costs have on our customers. And so, to the extent that this is able to provide a benefit there, that was interesting to me. I guess one thing on the Minnesota costs that were mentioned, I'm not the expert on that, but just from other internal conversations we've had, I've heard that those were in those analysis, the non-wireless alternative costs were somewhere in the order of 8 times more expensive than the ones that they've evaluated. So I'm sure as technology progresses and costs come down on DER technologies, that will change, and as well as the considerations that were mentioned for societal benefits and things of that nature. I guess reflective thoughts I had there on just the system configuration. Is there any difference on whether loads are in a rural system where they're more spread out versus a more urban concentrated system as far as the application of non-wires alternatives, and is there any additional risks there for a more rural system with larger loads further from the substations?
Lauren, any response?
Yeah, I think the main observation that I'm having is that some of these substation load growth type needs are the ones that I'm seeing more frequently in urban areas. And then actually some of the largest, kind of most successful transmission deferral projects have been in rural areas. So particularly when we think about really expensive lines that are actually not connecting very much load to very much load that need to be replaced or at risk from high winds and things like that, or over really rough terrain. Those are also really great candidates for thinking about non-wire solutions in a rural context.
Hyde Park.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Ron.
Yes, thank you. Again, thanks, Lauren and the team here for this great presentation. I was struck by the concept and implementation of incentives for utilities, and it's not just mandates. I'm not sure if we do much of that in New Mexico. I must say I'm not as familiar with it. We've been really concentrating on my thoughts about how do we mandate this. But my experience is that when the market, when the experts at the utilities are part of the team, we'll get a better outcome. And so I would certainly like to see incentives as well as mandates.
Great, thanks, Ron. Rico.
Yes, thank you. I guess my question, and so I'll turn it into a comment, follows and concurs with Kyle in terms of looking at non-wires possibilities on a distribution side that are inside of New York City. I actually had to do a little bit of research on that project because it was brought up at a time when we were putting in a substation, and geez, you look at the city of Las Cruces and Doña Ana County, and the amount of population that we have probably fits inside of a couple blocks of New York City, and then the load to that end is probably just one of the portions of JFK airport, and so I don't know how to put those pieces together to make looking at a state where Las Cruces at 150,000 people is the second largest city in the state, in the fourth largest geographic area of in the country. So I don't know, that's so I had a question, but I think Kyle kind of framed that well. So I just wanted to leave my 2 cents there, and I'll leave my comments there.
Yeah. Thanks, Rico. I think you're getting to our next section, which is about interpretive. It's like, what does this mean for us? We've got these examples from these big metropolitan areas, but what does this mean for New Mexico? Lauren, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reflections that I'm having is the total size often isn't the important part as much as how fast things are growing and what the system is designed to do today. So we can have really rural low load circuits that are expected to see 3 or 4 electric vehicles come onto them that are going to necessitate huge upgrades. So starting to think about the change between today and the future possible state, I think is a great way to think about where these opportunities might be most prevalent as well.
Thank you. Pat.
Just to pile on with the thank you to Lauren, learned that NWA is more than just the pinnacle of gangster rap. So that was a great addition to my day. And then that conversation about the split of investment in New Mexico, and we seem to be spending more on transmission and distribution, and it'd be great to dig a little deeper into that and maybe benchmark it to something like sales. Generally, when we're making investments in transmission, those investments are also coming with new revenue because we're connecting wind resources to markets across the West. So I'm not sure that that's a bad outcome that we're spending more on transmission because we're helping with the clean energy transition broadly. But then to Ron's point about incentives, it just occurs to me that this world of investing in distribution system could also come with new revenue if it's paired with the overall strategy of electrifying everything. So we'll be not just changing how we're using electricity on the distribution grid, but changing opportunities of how that use can be modified, and while overall increasing sales.
Thank you, Pat. Matthew?
And since it's on the, what does it mean for New Mexico going forward? I think what where I'm at is just needing to understand where we're expecting growth, what we're anticipating, and then that way we can start analyzing what options we have out there. And then what I would like, what I'm thinking would be a good place to start there is just to figure out, okay, what is that balance of incentive and requirement on a go forward basis? Because I think if you were to just go whole hog in, I think it could be detrimental to the ratepayers to just go out with a, hey, here's a mandate. Well, you've seen how it rolled out in the others where it's not quite at cost effective. I think we're at that stage now where, hey, let's all experiment, to Brian's a very apt point, taking in, because since you're talking about distribution, you have to take in the uniqueness of each system, the fact that some are rural, some are not. So I think it's just about figuring out the game plan for that interim that we're in before we really have that full step to electrification. And then just generally though, as far as distribution goes, we always have to prove up distribution in a rate case, make sure that it's been, prudently spent. And on top of that, as far as, how we've done on the lower spending, I think the fact that we've had good safeties should be a good sign as to the fact that, hey, it's not because we're being cheap here, it's because we're being efficient.
Thank you, Matthew. Vice Chair Hall.
Thank you. I had sort of a confused feeling when I was thinking about the fact that you were mentioning that that the speaker was mentioning about distribution system costs increasing, and I guess I just have a little cognitive dissonance between that and then the concept of incentives for utilities, because if distribution costs are increasing and non-wires alternatives can permit them to avoid some investment in distribution system components, then that helps their financial picture. So why would they need incentives to do something that would ultimately reduce their level of investment in their level of capital investment? And essentially the investment gets shifted to, for example, consumers who have more DER on their rooftops. And so that's a question in my mind. But to Matthew's comment about planning, I think another thing that can be beneficial to utilities and cost saving in the future, but I'd like to understand your thoughts of it as well, is the planning component, because of course you want to know where development will be. And in a way, the process of system planning, utility distribution system planning could, in effect, dictate to some extent where development would be, most beneficial from this cost perspective anyhow. So it almost implicates involvement with just general city planning in a way. But in any case, planning is an important component. And I was wondering when I was looking at those bar graphs about in New York and California, there were many projects that were looked at that were not cost effective, whether they had been examined through, a broader planning lens or not. But in any case, what hits me here is, won't, the distribution planning component that I think needs to be involved in non-wires alternative really benefit utilities financially.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hall. Commissioner Fishman?
Yeah, thank you. A question for Lauren is that with electrification and transportation electrification, we're going to be putting a lot more demands on the distribution system. In terms of non-wires, do these trends, what kind of impact do these trends in your research have on potential non-wires applications?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think where I'm seeing this come into play is that managed charging can actually be a huge part of a non-wires portfolio when we're thinking about the need to avoid distribution system costs. And then I will say too, there's a lot of research right now going into the impact of EVs on the distribution system. And I think that key first step is just understanding where they're going to materialize and really how much load could it be on what feeders and what impacts is that going to have. So the national labs are doing a lot of really great research on this right now.
So it seems to me that this, regardless of whether we want to invest more in distribution systems, we're likely going to have to. It's just a matter of how smart can we be about it. And, I see Matthew nodding his head with this stuff, and I'm glad to see him so engaged. But it seems that with that investment, as we get into this whole non-wires stage, we're going to see a lot of potential proposals that financially won't pan out, but we kind of have to look at this as we know we're going through this transition. If we get this process in place, we can catch the wave timely rather than having made a lot of investments that we might not have made if we were looking forward. And that even if we find a lot of projects that financially don't pan out, just the fact that we're scanning the horizon has huge potential benefits for us. And that's kind of the attitude we should have in approaching this. Is that a valid observation in your estimation?
Absolutely. Yep.
Chairman Fishman, appreciate that. Our last section of our discussion is decisional, right? Is trying to get to some agreement here on what needs work, what we can agree upon. And so certainly knowing that vehicle electrification is coming, something I think we can all agree upon. I think I also heard with incentives, it's like, where does the incentive come in, or does it come in? How do we use that to be able to incent direction for utilities? So let's go next to Matthew and then to Rico. And if you can try to triangulate on what needs work and what can we agree upon, what do we need to do next? That would be helpful. So thank you, Matthew.
And to respectfully address the question posed by Commissioner Hall, the question was, in regards to the incentives, and this does tie back into how to go forward. What it comes down to is, what are we going to define that goes into determining whether or not we move forward with a project? Secondly, how are we going to determine the recovery mechanism for that investment? Are we going to apply an EE standard, because a lot of this has a flavor of EE, or are we going to take a look that these investments are part of your distribution network and therefore they follow a standard distribution recovery model? And so I think that's the sort of framework that we got to go. And that's why we talk about incentives here, Commissioner Hall, is that if you apply a certain lens to it, then it has to follow that you're going to have an incentive go into that particular universe. So I think we need to first determine the path. First determine what we expect to see on the horizon, and then break down those various items to get down to a good regulatory construct.
Thank you, Matthew. And Rico, I saw your hand was up and then down. I didn't want to not have you say what you wanted to say, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if I did that or how that went down, but anyways, thank you for the time. One of the things that I have not heard very much here, especially in the non-wires piece, and is very important in New Mexico, is equity. How we do this equitably. I think in a lot of ways you could see a lot of non-wire solutions that would kind of follow the map of our rooftop solar map, which if you looked at it from a map overlay that solar map with Las Cruces, our largest city in our territory, the question of equity would definitely be prominent. And how do you get this kind of infrastructure into homes that may not be equipped for non-wire solutions, and how do you do that in a way that is equitable across all socioeconomic pieces? And I think that's one piece that can be lost, especially again in such a rural state as ours. We share two districts inside of two distinct districts in El Paso Electric, one in Texas, one in New Mexico. Our population level per mile of line in Texas is much more dense than it is in New Mexico. Our issues of low income customers are probably right about the same. So how do you do that in a way that keeps New Mexico at a cost that's somewhat reasonable to that end? And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rico. Lauren, any comments from you on that?
I guess I would just add that Oregon is thinking about this a lot as they think about both their framework for how the utilities might go about pursuing projects. They've outlined some really forward-thinking community engagement ideas, and are also really thinking about equity as a core component of their updated benefit cost analysis framework as well, that they'll use to evaluate future projects. So I think there's a lot to look at in terms of what's coming out of the distribution system planning docket and the plans in Oregon with respect to community engagement, what that could look like, and how non-wires might support that.
So Chair Fishman, if I can ask you just to wait a minute. Rico, did you have a response to that?
I left one thing out, I'm sorry. And so, one of the things that El Paso Electric is doing is working with the Department of Health on how this type of the data that we're going to be able to receive from increasing our technology on the distribution side for our communities is something that we need to think about as well. Even as we're talking about infrastructure, how customers are going to use it is going to be important, and that's just as important as how they're using health data from their own bodies. And so those are some things that we're thinking about. And in my mind, in this times that we are facing right now, which I think could be years of supply chain issues, is this a time where we think about how our culture of energy is used and how we focus on that as people that work in the energy realm? Think about this stuff as we move into continuing the climate change issues that we're all really dealing with here. I mean, that's the overall issue that we all have to tackle. And again, I'll leave my comments there, but we have an immediate issue of where does steel go into, and that is a huge problem across the board.
And Rico did leave off that we are also exploring community-based solutions and working with our customers as well to achieve those similar results.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Okay, so we're going to wind up with a few comments. So Chairman.
He's not chairman anymore. You mean Commissioner Fishman?
Oh, that's
former chairman?
Yeah, former chairman. That's a good thing. I missed it. Yeah.
So a couple things to think about following up on Rico's observations is I'm sure interested when we address an issue for a particular community, in theory, that has system-wide benefits. And so to me, one of the big challenges here for all of us is to figure out ways that those system-wide benefits get shared. And that's a big piece in my mind, of addressing the equity issue that Rico raises. So I just want to be sure we're kind of looking at both sides of that equation. And the second observation I'd make is that, and I may be wrong, it seems to me that pursuing, given the supply chain issues that we've got, that pursuing these kinds of solutions may actually help mitigate some of the capacity issues, for lack of a better word, that we might be facing going forward. So Lauren, please tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that supply chain issues are challenging the DER space too. So I would need more data on that is my answer. But there's probably benefits and trade-offs, both approaches. I'm sure I could justify some supply chain related benefits of a more DER centric approach.
Okay. But I'd love to hear creative thoughts from anybody here about how we look at distributing the costs and the benefits of non-wires solutions. And I think that's a real challenge.
Yeah, agreed. Let's go to Jim, and then we're going to go to Howard for last comment.
Thank you very much. And this is a question for Lauren. You mentioned, I believe, a couple pilot programs, and I was just curious how those looked and how did they get started, and maybe a little information you could share on those. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of non-wires pilot programs to look at and learn from. One of the more interesting approaches was California, when they were first looking at non-wire solutions, had each of the utilities do a number of pilots specifically oriented towards addressing specific types of needs. So they took this really kind of portfolio approach to their pilot projects and said, we're just gonna try this for these different types of needs and see what sticks. So their lessons learned from that process, I think, are really interesting. The pilot ongoing in Minnesota is in partnership with the CNEE, which is a local community-based organization. So it also really has this flavor of how do we engage a local geographic area to install a large quantity of energy efficiency and demand response in a way that is beneficial for avoiding future feeder and substation upgrades in that specific area. And that'll be really interesting to look at as well. There's a write-up on that in their most recent distribution system plan report too, in terms of what they're learning and what they're seeing from that project.
Great. And was that Excel you said?
Yep.
That's
yep.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Howard.
Thanks, Laura, great presentation. We're at Sandia are involved now in dynamics model with the PRC, with the MNRD and PNM, figure out how to meet incredibly complex, and so it's
Howard,
strikes me that, I mean, this.
Can you write it in the chat?
I'm breaking up.
Yeah, Howard, yeah, it's
I'll
kind of
do that.
impossible. Yeah, and I do want to point out that there's a comment in the chat about state agencies and local governments need to initiate projects or come up with project idea and apply for some of the grant funding that was talked about earlier. So yeah, I agree. Howard, can you turn off your video is off and try it one more time? Or put it in the chat. And then while he's doing that, Deborah, why don't we go ahead and pull up our slides, and we'll still give Howard the last word. And Lauren, thank you. Excellent.
Well,
go ahead, Howard. Sorry.
No, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
No, we can't hear you.
Okay, Howard, we're sorry. You're not coming through. If you can put it in the chat, we
need to build a model of the system, and then we can evaluate all the trade-offs. Otherwise, there's no.
Yeah, Howard, we're going to need you to put it in the chat if you can over the next couple minutes, and we'll make sure to read it. Web, love it. So Lauren, thank you so much. Great presentation. Really appreciate all the follow-up and questions back and forth. So what we do at the end is we do a participant survey, and we do it based on what our objectives were, and our objectives were to try to get to basic information and be able to portray to you what is upcoming with non-wires alternatives, and then also be able to gather from you information that'll be useful for developing a NOPR. So I see you're already at it, which I appreciate. Give you one more minute. And then Howard, if you don't get a chance to put your comments in the chat, if you want to send an email to me, we're happy to include it in the minutes. So great. Thank you, everybody. Deb, I think you can take that down. Looks like we have a good response. We met our objectives. Our objective is not that everybody agree with everything said, but that we are moving in where we're trying to go, which is to help the PRC collect the information to develop a rule. So if you want to take that down, that would be great. Oh, share results. Do you see results? I never know how this works.
It's just about models, so I can understand complexity, trade-offs.
Okay. Great, thanks everybody. And then Deb, if you'll go back to what comes next, thank you very much. So our next webinar is going to be on transportation electrification. And I hope you've noticed that we've been building these webinars. So we've talked about things like AMI, and then host capacity, and then non-wires alternatives. Now we're going to talk about transportation electrification. We're trying to build out that body so we have good information to build on when we do this rule. So that's May 19th. And then June 2nd, we're going to be talking about how do we evaluate grid investments. You know, I think by participating that we really want to try to focus on both how do utilities apply for funding and how do the PRC evaluate these investment opportunities that are being put forward. So we appreciate everybody's attendance today. And great engagement. It was just a terrific discussion. I think, Lauren, you prepped it well and everybody fully engaged. So any last comments for anybody before we sign off for the day?
You do have Howard's more of a comment than a question in the chat, just to share with everybody, and others have already responded to it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. Can we have to build system models so that we can understand complexities and trade-offs. Otherwise, we're just guessing. Great. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I hope everybody has a good weekend when we reach it. And thanks very much for joining today.
Reminder to Isaac to please leave the line open for our debrief.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I think we can stop recording. Thank you.
I think it is the policy